everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of WIF Vichaar. My name is Namrata Joshi, and I'm the co-head of talks at WIF. It is my honor to host and introduce our guest speaker for today, Ms. Preet Kaur Gill. Ms. Gill is a British Labour co-op politician, serving as a Member of Parliament for Birmingham, Edgbaston since 2017. She is also the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development since April 2020. I'm very proud to say that she's also the first female British Sikh MP. Ms. Gill chairs the All-Party Parliamentary Group for British Sikhs. Her other achievements also include receiving the Sikh Women of Substance Award by the Sikh Women's Alliance UK in October 2018. In December 2018, she was one of the recipients of the Giving Voice Award presented by the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists. Today, Ms. Gill and I are going to discuss her journey into entering politics and breaking stereotypes. Welcome, Ms. Gill. We are so happy to have you on WIF Vichaar.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be joining you today. I'm Namrata.
Thank you, ma'am. To start off, as the first female British Sikh MP, why did you decide to enter politics? Was it a lifelong dream or an opportunity that presented itself at the right time? Additionally, did you have a role model who inspired you to chase this dream?
So I think I was always interested in politics. My father and I used to, watch loads of politic programs, whether it was Question Time, the news, and regularly sort of debate, foreign affairs and global issues, really. And so I think my interest started from a quite a young age without realizing. Actually, my brothers and sisters used to think it was quite geeky and quite strange that I had this kind of. So my siblings always thought it was really geeky that I shared this interest with my father. My father was very active actually in politics, and that's probably the other reason and the other influences that I got involved. So he was active in our local Labour Party, he was active locally, so campaigning. He would get involved, and actually he stood to become a local councillor, and it was something that he felt that he wanted to give back into the community. He was already doing a huge range of support for our community. Many people used to say to me that your house is like this your house is like a railway station, because we'd have this constant flow of people coming in, always seeking advice and support from my father. And of course my dad used to sort of say to everyone, really, if you need any advice, if you need anything, any help in filling out forms, please come over. And of course, who would be the one that's going to be giving that advice? It would be me. And I would say, oh my God, Dad, you've really got to stop this. But back then, I mean, there wasn't the kind of services for many of our communities in terms of knowing what they could access in terms of support, or knowing who to go to when they had a problem. And so places of worship became this kind of a place not for people just come and obviously acts of faith, etc., but actually became an institution that was now offering lots of different services in terms of welfare support, women's issues, trying to raise those. And so I saw my father, to partake in this. He was my role model, really, because I saw him as this person who was not just sort of, disengaging from his community, but actually wanted to help, but not just going as far as inviting people into our home to say, can I support you, but actually challenging the structures to understand what the needs of various communities were locally. And he was able to work with other organizations and other faith groups to really lobby and bring that recognition of equality and human rights and, racial issues that were taking place, especially in the 80s. My father was president of one of the largest gurdwaras in the country, and one of the oldest gurdwaras. And so being the head of a gurdwara at a time actually in the 80s when there was a recession in the local area, so it was very, very difficult. And I saw my father, that we see the concept of a soup kitchen and free food being served by many communities actually during times of crisis. But actually I saw my father lead on something like that back in the 80s. I remember there was a factory across the road from the Gurdwara. It was a cheese factory. And I remember him going to purchase cheese and fill this van up, and they would drive around various roads and distribute cheese to people in the local area. It just brings me back to how actually my father had this foresight and was quite innovative. One of the other things that really inspired me about my father was that in the 80s, of course, when lots of girls were coming from India being married here, what we term as domestic abuse or, those kind of issues wasn't really a term that existed back in those days. And those support services, especially people from our communities, were pretty much non-existent. And so it was very difficult because, you had women who didn't have their families here in this country when they came, pretty much isolated, didn't know what was available or what their rights were. And I remember my father set up what is called a Smaj Sudhar kind of set up within the Gurdwara. And really what that actually meant in reality was, it was my father and 4 or 5 committee members who basically, when any girl came to make a complaint or said I needed support, they would absolutely sort of say to her, we will, give you assistance. And the assistance was to go into speak to her in-laws and the husband as a meeting, as members of our community, to really sort of challenge as to, how they were treating their daughter-in-laws, etc. But my father, that was really important. He had 5 daughters, and he really understood, what that kind of responsibility of when you get married, but also some of the issues that were prevalent in the community. He didn't shy away from those. He didn't brush those under the carpet. He was really at the forefront. And I remember on a number of occasions, he would say to me at 10 o'clock at night, we've got to go to this place. You need to come with us. And I remember going and speaking to some of these women who were going through difficult issues, and my father making sure that they had the opportunity to talk to me privately and really specifying that. So, what I saw was actually, if you want to change any system, if you want to advance concerns for any community, then you really have got to be part of that system, and that's the only way to affect change. And I don't think you realise that when you're at university, in terms of, because you're still exploring what it is that you want to do. And I studied sociology, so I was interested in terms of how society runs and functions. So there was always that natural interest. And then I went on to do social work, and so I think even more so there was that link. And working in London and here, and just seeing the kind of impact of public services and policy having on frontline and safeguarding children and young people. Part of my degree, I was very lucky to have gone to study at Delhi University. So in my final year of my degree, I did a project in India where I lived in Delhi for about 9 months. And it was really life-changing, I would say, for me, because I was really interested in seeing that kind of cross-cultural perspective of how states function. And it was quite an eye-opener to then come to India and realise that actually it isn't the state, it's actually the non-government organisations that are pretty much providing support to those that need it, whether it's from rural villages or the most poorest, whether it's about water and sanitisation or safeguarding. That was really quite eye-opening for me, and I think studying safeguarding and wanting to do social work, for example, all of a sudden now you are thrust in India where you are seeing children walking around the streets and begging, and that obviously makes you feel uncomfortable. It also makes you challenge, well, what's happening to the system here, and why is it not the same as other places? And then you realise actually when you look at the culture and society and then the setup. But it is very difficult. It's still difficult today when you see that around the world. It's not just in India, it's prevalent in so many places. Should the state be doing much more? Should we be legislating to protect our most vulnerable, especially our children? And so there was always that, I think, inherent kind of interest. And, I went and studied, I went and worked and lived on a kibbutz in Israel. I, again, really interested in how that communal living and what that meant actually for people in terms of, those that actually owned their own properties and those that were part of this kind of communal living. Really, really insightful. So I was somebody that was not just interested in politics from a perspective of academia or just here in the United Kingdom. I was interested about it sort of globally and travelled and wanted to learn from other communities and other places in terms of the issues that they were going through. So my father was pretty much a role model, and I remember he once said to me, you should really go into politics, because you've got an opinion about everything, you're very passionate and you want to give back. And of course, when you've kind of gone through the education system, and you think you're acquiring the right knowledge and the skills, then you actually put yourself forward to these positions. It's suddenly quite an eye-opener when you realise that the system and the process by which what you thought it was is clearly not, is actually something that we should all be aware of when we're, whatever it is that we're applying for. What is the process? What is this? How does the system work? Because it's only then that you can really navigate it. So when I went to put myself forward, just locally, my branch, I was blocked for many, many years. And I just really couldn't understand it, because I had to question myself, well, I live in the wards that I want to represent. I have the kind of skills, the passion. I care about my communities. I have really good kind of relationships with them. Why is this kind of happening? And then you suddenly realize how the power structures work and how you then need to conform and work within that. And I think, you are challenged in terms of your own principles of why you want to enter into something. So I remember being blocked and saying to my dad, well, actually, why would I want to do politics? Because this is really difficult. They don't want me. They don't, if I've got the skill sets and I'm being treated in this way, then surely this is not for me. And he said, no, you mustn't just, deter and just at the first hurdle. You've got to keep being persistent. If it's something you want, you must go for it. And I remember Lord King, who was, he was the ex-leader of the council as well. And I remember him coming to speak to me saying, no, absolutely, we need to have more representation, especially if you think about BAME communities and women from our communities not putting themselves forward for lots of different reasons. It's really important that you do come to the forefront. And so I remember that working with them and building those links, finally I managed to get a selection and stood as a local councillor for a seat in my local area. And that's really how my journey into politics became. And by that time, actually, I'd already got married as well. So I remember being pregnant and campaigning, as I got selected. And so my children have pretty much grown up with me being in politics, being interested in politics, and have become almost accustomed to that now as well.
Yeah, that's actually a great insight, the entire story that you've told us. It's quite different because we look at Indian politics, and then for someone else to compete in Britain politics is something we haven't really seen as an Indian student. Moving on, today there are many British citizens of Indian origin in politics who occupy prestigious positions in the government. For example, there's Rishi Sunak, there's Preet Patel, and yourself. Would you say that British Indian politicians are gradually making it to the core of British politics?
Yes, I think so. I think it's taken us a lot longer. If we look at places like Canada, for example, even though migration of Indian populations happened much later than migration to, for example, from India to UK happened, they've actually advanced much more than we have in terms of being active in politics, being in very senior key roles in the cabinet, whether it's in Trudeau's or the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, and what they've been able to do is really become politically engaged right from the outset. In a way that I think many of our communities just didn't. Most of our parents, when they came here to this country and migrated, they just wanted to make a better life for themselves. And so they came together and really, they found that kind of support within their own mechanism, and they had to identify with that, with those kind of organizations that were set up to support them, because it was difficult. It was difficult in the workplace. I remember my father told me stories, this is before he joined a trade union, for example, is that, they would line up for their pay package, and they'd get their pay, and then there would be two of the men who were part of where they worked, that then they had to pay their wages, a proportion of their wages to them. And this continued to happen until one day my father decided to say, no, this is not justice. This is not even right. Why on earth should we have to keep continuing with this situation? And he remembers how he took that on and he thought he would lose his job. And it kind of got into a brawl situation, but actually his foreman sided with him and supported him. And as a result of that, I think, that the workforce really appreciated him taking a stand. I mean, it was very difficult if you think about the racism that many of our communities faced when they migrated here, whether it was from housing, whether it was around job opportunities. It was very, very difficult for our parents. But for some reason, they didn't think to get politically engaged to kind of get their issues into the system and then try and advance those. For some reason, they became very resilient, and they worked together, and they want, for them, it was about giving your children the good education, good opportunities, owning your own homes. These were the kind of things that many from our community, those are the kind of value bases that they came with. They didn't want to be reliant on the system as well. They weren't aware always of what the system was able to offer them. So I think, if you think in the last 30, 40 years, we haven't seen the kind of political advancements from people from India, for example, in the UK. And that's something that I always challenge our communities about, is about how we think about that political engagement. And how important it is that we push more young people into politics. Because, of course, as you will know, most of our parents, the kind of professions that they push us towards are become a doctor, it's either run the family business or become a dentist or a lawyer. These are the kind of professions really that our parents see as being good and reputable. And I don't think anybody ever thought politics as a kind of career thing. It's something that you happen to either get involved in or had an interest in, or by chance, you know, got involved in it. But I think it's so important. I think if you think about what's happening in the globe, what's happening here, you know, to have a voice. Of course, there are excellent MPs that represent diverse communities who stand up and speak up for those communities excellently. But it is important having your own voice. And I think I have felt that for my community coming into politics. I see the barriers that exist. It is not easy to affect change. You know, but we have to work collaboratively in terms of, I think the one thing from the Black Lives Matter movement is, you know, where we are as a BAME, you know, we have BAME representation and MPs, we've got to work together, we've got to be a collective voice on some of the big issues. All communities trying to work in silo, trying to raise their own issues. Yes, it's important, of course it is, but we are a much stronger voice when we come together on some of those issues that we face together. So I think that's really, really important. Yeah.
So as we're aware, you are the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development. Their main objective is to promote sustainable development and eliminate world poverty. What initiatives are you planning to take in order to overcome these challenges which the globe is facing?
Yeah, firstly, I have to say it's an absolute privilege to be doing this role, you know, helping the most poorest in the world and the most vulnerable, especially at a time in terms of this global pandemic and what that actually means, because we haven't seen the kind of peaks in the globe that we would have expected to have seen by now. And, you know, it would be interesting to hear from you, Namrata, in terms of what's happening in India. But of course, in the absence of testing and tracing and isolating, it is very difficult in some of these countries, as you know, to self-isolate, especially for the most poorest, because those that live in slum dwellings have absolutely nowhere to escape, and they don't have access to wash facilities. You know, 3 billion people around the world still don't have access to wash facilities in their home. And in the absence of the vaccine, these are the only things that are really going to help us, you know, keep them safe and protected, and especially their families. So one of our focuses, of course, has been, since we've been appointed, myself and the Shadow team, has been our focus in terms of what is the response to the global pandemic. And so we put a call out to evidence to the sector, and we had over 75 submissions, just highlighting what the concerns were across the global south, from what's happening in favelas in Brazil, but also in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, around slum dwellings. And, you know, if people from the poorest are expected to go back to their rural villages, for example, you know, how do we take into account hunger as a real issue, not just in places like India and Pakistan, but also across the global south? We are seeing that more people are vulnerable to dying from hunger before they are going to die from COVID-19. And this is a real concern and real issue about food security, but also if you look at the locust crop, what's happening as a result of locust swarms to crops, you know, so there's a huge amount of work to be done in terms of our response, in terms of what we would expect from the leadership in the United Kingdom. What's been really concerning, though, is we haven't seen that leadership on the global stage, because this was a time to bring so many countries together and coordinate that response. And so, you know, the vehicle that we have is the WHO, and we absolutely must support that multilateral system. But what we've seen is, with Trump retreating from that, is that the UK government hasn't been able to bring him back to the table. And I think that's the kind of leadership around collaboration and cooperation that we would expect to see. The other thing that we've been calling for is an end to debt cancellation, because it cannot be right that so many countries in sub-Saharan Africa are having to pay huge amounts to debt, as opposed to thinking about strengthening their own health systems and safeguarding their own people. And it's absolutely got to be right. Some of these countries just have 24 ventilators, for example, 4 ICU beds. I mean, you know, when you really think about the inequalities that exist already, and the fact we're going to have a much more unequal world, it's really stark. We have the NHS here. So many countries just don't have the benefits of those systems. So one of the things I want to push for is a global health strategy, supporting countries to invest in universal healthcare. This is a fundamental human right that everybody should have access to. It shouldn't be about whether you can afford healthcare or not. And nobody should have to be turned away, as we have seen in some places, from healthcare facilities when they are most in need. And of course, in conflict situations, that's even more prevalent, because a third of Yemeni population just don't have access to healthcare facilities. And that's another thing that we were calling for, is for the UN Security Council to declare a global ceasefire. And it They have done that now, but it took much longer. And of course, what that means is where there is conflict, Yemen being the world's worst humanitarian crisis, access to humanitarian aid has been a real concern. And, you know, we're not hearing all of the information, which is the biggest worry in places like Yemen, for example. What is the rate of infection? How many deaths have actually taken place? We are hearing information from, you know, whether it's from healthcare facilities, from doctors about the dire situation, and from the sector. But these are the sort of issues that are really most concerning to us. And so, you know, they absolutely have got to be focusing in terms of what the pandemic means for these countries. And we've got to learn from the Ebola crisis, for example, because more women died from maternal death than they did from Ebola. So the work that DFID does in terms of existing programs and those continuing is absolutely important, because whilst we are dealing with the pandemic, we're also simultaneously dealing with other issues which can't just be put on the back burner. Vaccination programs for young children. These are huge concerns. And then, of course, it's about the global solidarity that we show. This is a time for internationalism, of coming together, you know, of recognizing that if domestic abuse is high in the UK, so is it in the global south. And can we just imagine, we've got to be able to absolutely at this time show that solidarity. Of course, we've got to make sure that, you know, our citizens are looked after, and they have, you know, the test trace facilities, and, you know, all the other things that we're doing in terms of our domestic responsibilities. But of course, that shouldn't be at the expense of the, you know, international cooperation that we would expect to see, especially at this time. And then, of course, the other thing that we've been pushing for is that when there is a vaccine available, it's got to be equitable, and it's got to be available to everybody that needs it. It can't be right that it's going to be the richest countries that benefit and their citizens benefit at the expense of the poorer countries. And so this is another thing that I think is so important. We've been working across our departments, you know, to make sure that there's coherence from our base team that have been leading on some of this work, and our health team, so that there's a real joint approach. And of course, and the other thing is, you know, we want to see the UK be leading on some of these issues. I think the fact that we've heard about the takeover of DFID is a huge concern, especially at a time of a global pandemic, when we should be reaching out and not actually retreating, as we've seen this Prime Minister do, and reshuffling a Whitehall department, which is going to cost the UK taxpayer £50 million. You know, this is a time that we should absolutely be focused on domestic priorities, but also our international priorities in terms of bringing, you know, to the fore the issues that I've just raised, and really advancing those. So there's a number of things that really we've been pushing for. You know, I'm really concerned in terms of we haven't seen the peaks, you know, globally. So it is a worry, and it's a real concern about what's happening in many countries. You know, so yeah, and we will continue to, you know, push to be a strong voice for those that need us to be, especially when this government is just focused on reshuffling a Whitehall department, which again will take resource away, it will take the expertise away from the places that they absolutely should be focused and coordinating, and making sure money that's been pledged actually reaches those very communities that need it. Of course, it's right to support the multilateral system, but we've also got to take cognizance that there are civil society groups on the ground that absolutely need that support right now, and going through, putting money through big multilateral systems, which bureaucracy delays that money getting to where it needs, is another huge concern, and something that we are, again, been pushing for.
Okay, that's great, actually. Next, according to the Forbes magazine, countries such as New Zealand, Denmark, Germany, and Taiwan have something very inspiring in common, which is women leaders. As a woman in politics yourself, do you believe that these evolving times provide women with the opportunity to break stereotypes by entering politics?
Yes, I think we need to have more women, and women shouldn't feel that they can't enter into politics. And for far too long, it has been that case. You know, women haven't felt that there's been the support available for them, or the encouragement and pushing them. And of course, there are lots of reasons for that in terms of why we haven't seen so many more women coming forward. I think what you have seen, though, is in terms of the Labour Party here in the United Kingdom, you know, we have over 50% women in our party as members of Parliament, which is a great achievement. And it has been wonderful to see our first Chancellor, the Shadow Secretary, who is Annalise Dodds, and she is formidable. She's absolutely brilliant. And again, Bridget, who's Chief of Treasury. So we also have Lisa Nandy, who's in our Foreign Office Secretary of State. So you're seeing lots more women in the Labour Party in some of those very, very key roles. And I think that's really encouraging. It gives a very strong message, in terms of what the Labour Party's commitments are in terms of advancing gender equality and also giving opportunities for more women. And I'm really grateful that Keir has absolutely shown that leadership, and, it's absolutely reflective in our party. But I think, we've seen female leaders really rise up to the challenge and deliver in terms of the global pandemic. And I think there's some learning lessons that we should take from that and feel inspired. I certainly am inspired when I see those women, standing up there. And sometimes it's very difficult in politics because there isn't always the support or the encouragement. And, you pretty much are, in a way, the journey is quite personal to you because, you're having to build yourself and your own self-identity within that role. And of course, you have lots of other responsibilities. Let's not forget, the added difficulties for a lot of women, for example, I feel it as well in lockdown, is you are still a mother and you are still a wife and you are still a daughter, especially from our community, for example, there are all those expectations. And so whilst you're still trying to do your job, you're still having to assume all these other responsibilities. They don't go away. And they're not as shared always as evenly. And I think that really puts a lot of pressure on women, and we have to work that much more harder, and I don't think that always gets recognised, and it's not always at the forefront. But I think those female leaders have just been absolutely inspiring.
Yeah, that's very true. Like you mentioned earlier, the COVID-19 situation, I'm sure, has adversely impacted your duties, even as a member of parliament. So what are the few responsibilities that you really had to undertake, since it was so sudden, all of it together, and fulfill your duties in that manner?
I think it's been a real challenge for us all because it's about different ways of working. And I think the biggest concern for me was about giving my team that support and enabling them to be able to make sure that we continue to function as an office and are responsive to our constituents and, available to them. I think that's been so important, is so many people have really sort of appreciated that, the fact that our office hours have remained the same. Our, phone lines have been open 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. I think people have really appreciated that they've been able to get in touch with us and we've been available and responsive. Of course, that has meant that we have had a huge increase in terms of emails and concerns from people, because people's circumstances are very, very different. In my constituency, for example, we have 10,000 constituents who are furloughed, who are concerned about what it means for them in terms of their own job security, more people losing jobs and having to apply for universal credit. So there's been a range of issues that we've had to prioritise. And then, of course, being appointed to the Shadow Cabinet during that period as well is additional responsibilities. But, so it's really been great that the team and I have been able to have Zoom calls every day. We've been looking at what our priorities are, and having virtual calls with constituents more and more, I think, has been really, really important for them, because whilst we can't be out campaigning and, we can't have physical surgeries, being able to actually have Zoom calls has been really quite refreshing. I think constituents have really appreciated the kind of engagement that we've been doing around that. But it has been full on. And what I would say is about working from home is that there really isn't the separation. You can log on from 9 and you can still be at your computer at 7. And I think that's really been quite a challenge in terms of switching off. I don't think it's been easy to switch off. I don't think most of us have switched off, if I'm honest with you. So I think we're all very looking forward to the recess. And even in the recess, we'll be working. Because of course, the office is still open and there'll be lots of inquiries and engagement events that we will continue to do virtually whilst we're in lockdown.
Yeah. Lastly, what advice would you like to give to aspiring Indian students studying in Britain who wish to follow in your footsteps?
I would say, be clear about what you want to do in terms of your dreams. Think big, have a plan, write it down, be specific. In terms of what your aspirations are, and then don't reinvent the wheel. Model what's already been done. Seek mentors. I mean, it's something that I did throughout my life and my career pathway, and even now, is seek a mentor, because it's so important to be challenged. It's so important to learn from others, and I found that to be really, really helpful. And what I would say is don't be put off. Yes, you might be doing another kind of have a kind of different career pathway and want to seek professionalism in another route. But, you know, it doesn't mean to say you can't then be active in politics, because you can be a member of a local party, for example. You can be locally active, you can campaign on issues, you know, you can support candidates that you think, you know, are doing a really good job and reflect your kind of value systems. There's lots of different ways of being involved in politics. It isn't always about standing as a candidate, although that is, you know, one route into it. And what I would say as well is, if you do go back to India, if you're studying here as students, is, you know, is really, I want to see more young Indians get involved in politics in India. I don't think I'm sure there's lots of barriers, and it's very, very difficult, and it's not easy to navigate that system. But I think, you know, there's some phenomenal activists in India doing some great work, and it would be great to see some of those leading at the forefront of the issues, because India has a huge amount of issues to resolve, not to mention just the impact of the division of poverty, for example. But I think climate as well. I mean, it's you know, it's a huge area. I remember when I was in Delhi, just the smog, you know, is something I'd never seen in all my time of visiting. In the last couple of years, it's got much worse, and we've got to find solutions to these issues, you know, for the betterment of Indians as well. But yeah, I want to see those kind of young activists coming forward, especially in India, and feeling that they have a voice, and that they're able to really challenge the system, but also challenge legislation and lobby for the good. You know, there's a lot of positives, I think, that you can take from the United Kingdom in terms of how our democracy works, the protections that we have. And I think some of that, absolutely, when you go back home, you know, for example, LGBT rights has been a big movement in India in the last couple of years that we've seen, in a way that many of us wouldn't have seen those advancements. And I think that's really positive. It's because Indians are going out to study, and they are, you know, learning from other places. And I think that's so important. It's then, what do you take back to your own country? What do you take back that you want to change, and how do you create those social movements? I think, you know, I want to see more of those social movements around the world. Not just in India, but across the global south, for example, you know, but we've got to support them, because in some places they're not safe to speak out because of human rights violations and abuses, and we've got to take that into account. So how things are done is also equally important. But I hope they feel inspired. You know, I hope there's more women around the world that want to enter into politics and feel that, you know, they're able to, and they should be enabled. You know, it's so important that you have the support of your partner and your family when you're entering politics, because none of this is really possible without them. It makes it very difficult. If I didn't have the support of my husband, I'm not saying that was easy. I'm not saying he was always fully on board in terms of me entering politics. I think a lot of it was about not really knowing what it would entail, what it would mean in terms of impact on our own family life and myself. And so it does take time, and I think it's taken time for my family to adjust to that, especially my children. I don't think you realise just the kind of impact it has on your children when you're away from them, for example, being in Parliament, you know, the emotional impact it has on them. I think they, you know, they do adjust with it. And like I said, my kids have kind of grown up with me being in politics. They're now 9 and 8. So they're well accustomed to mummy not always being around, but it's not easy. And I do understand that women around the world have different, you know, with the different cultural expectations, you know, will face different barriers. But I encourage you to find a woman that you know has done it. Go out and seek support from her, seek mentors, don't deter from your dream. And let's see many more women of colour in politics.
We hope so too. And that's the main purpose of WIF Vichaar, is to really motivate and inspire our audience to learn from different people, hear their stories. And that brings us to the end of this wonderful interview. And it has been my honor to host you, ma'am. And I'm sure this conversation will inspire and motivate our audience all around the world. And on behalf of the Warwick India Forum team, I'd like to thank you for your time. And we wish that you and your family remain safe and in good health in all times.
Thank you so much. And I want to wish everybody at the Warwick India Forum all the very best. And I hope you can return and resume back to your studies here in the UK very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.